The Explorer's Guide to Wildemount is a setting book for D&D 5th edition that is a collaboration between Critical Role and Wizards of the Coast. It's a move that makes a lot of sense, but does the final product deliver, and is it worth your while? Let's take a look. Hi everybody, my name is Nate, and you are watching WASD20, a channel about tabletop RPGs and fantasy maps. In today's video, an in-depth review of the Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. In just a minute, we'll be cracking this thing open and taking a very in-depth look at the contents. However, if you're fairly new to Dungeons & Dragons, and maybe you're into Critical Role, but you've never actually played D&D yourself, you might be a little bit confused as to the place of this book amidst all the other books that you can buy for D&D 5th edition. And if that's true, you should definitely check out my Beginner's Guide to D&D, which I will put a link to right up there. It's got a buyer's guide, how to play D&D videos, and a lot of other good resources for newcomers. All right, let's get to the review. All right, my friends, here we have it, The Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. The tagline here, create your own Critical Role campaigns with this sourcebook for the world's greatest role-playing game. Not sure I'm a big fan of the create your own Critical Role campaigns. How about create your own awesome D&D campaigns using this book from Critical Role or this setting from Critical Role? Anyway, minor nitpick there. The cover itself, I'm a pretty big fan of this kind of dark line art style here. It's very comic booky in some ways, but I'm not a big fan of the floating busts, kind of these, I think this is the Queen of the Kryn Empire and the King of the Dwendalian Empire. Yeah, just a little bit weird and kind of abstract. They're floating busts over this otherwise rocky ruins landscape. But whatever, let's get into the substance of the book here. As we open it up, we can see that the lead writer is actually Matthew Mercer, so I think that's pretty cool that he is actually, the Dungeon Master of Critical Role, and appropriately so is the lead writer on the book, not just consulting on the project. There's a very nice foreword from Matthew Mercer as well, some wonderful inspirational words, and then we have Welcome to Wildemount. This is all just an introduction to the setting. What's in this book? What are the basics going on? This is a setting that is at war, if you run it as written. The Dwendalian Empire and the Kryn dynasty are the main forces at war here. This beautiful map by Devin Rue here, there is a larger version that came with the book as well. Tore this out of the back of the book, and it is a really nice map. I love Devin Rue. She's one of my favorite cartographers, and always great when they include a nice big map. I think that's a must in these setting books. It just really ups the value. So in terms of the war here, it is definitely one where you can choose as the Dungeon Master or as the player characters how much you want that war to be a factor in your game and how much you want to get involved in that war. Or you can just kind of ignore it completely. It does otherwise make a really great backdrop for other adventures, and they give you some ideas on how that could look here. The rest of this intro gets into some of the basics of the setting. I will note that the technology level is fairly similar to what you might find in Faerun, the Forgotten Realms, or other kind of traditional fantasy settings, but there is black powder, and so there is some higher technology that's really only in the hands of the military elite in some corners of this world. It's not going to be very common, quite rare, and difficult to get your hands on. Chapter 1 gets us into the lore, the history of Wildemount, and it does so in a way that I think is pretty good. It's not getting too lost in its own story here. I think it keeps it brief enough that it didn't lose me completely. At times I was getting a little bit bored, but I honestly just don't have much patience for reading lots of lore. I would like to. I want to be one of those people, but I'm not. But overall, I was really drawn in by the history. It's interesting stuff. I think they've got some really interesting ideas, and it's different enough from existing settings, kind of putting its own twist on fantasy, which I think is really cool. After a bit of history, you do get into this section on the Pantheon, so the prime deities here are mostly familiar to me, although there were some that I'm not familiar with. I'm not sure if they're new or if I'm just not familiar with them. And then you do have this section on betrayer gods, kind of the evil gods here. And lastly, we have this lesser idols, so these are a little bit more like demigods. Now, one thing I should probably mention is that Wildemount is one continent in the world of Exandria. Some of you might remember that there was a Tal'Dorei setting book, I might be saying that wrong, which was a Critical Role setting book as well a couple years ago, and that is, I think, a different continent in the world of Exandria. Critters, go ahead and correct me if I'm wrong there. That one was put out by Green Ronin Publishing. This one is now an official D&D 5e book put out by Wizards of the Coast. So, different continent in the same world, and this is the continent from Season 2 of Critical Role, so if you like Critical Role, there's going to be a whole lot here for you. You're going to learn so much more, and I think personally, this is a really nice companion for viewing the actual games. I haven't watched that much of it myself. I think I'm on like episode 5 or 6 of Season 2, and I watch like 2 episodes a year, roughly. Pretty pitiful. I would really like to watch more. I've enjoyed what I've seen so far, but I can already tell that reading this book would definitely enrich the experience of viewing the campaign. Okay, I'm mindlessly flipping through while I'm talking here, but we have entered Chapter 2. I do really like Chapter 1. I think it gives you the basics and doesn't get too in love with its own history that you kind of get lost in it. So, Chapter 2, Factions and Societies. The main factions here are the Dwendalian Empire and the Kryn Dynasty. And so those sections there is more detail on. But they have a really nice format for this chapter that I like a lot. It does get a little bit long. I did not enjoy trying to read it all the way through. I think it's better as kind of just a handy reference when you want to check out more detail on certain groups. But the Dwendalian Empire and the Kryn Dynasty are definitely must-reads. Those are the 2 groups at the heart of this war. And the way they format each section is they have a description of that group, they have a section on goals, relationships, and figures of interest. The figures of interest in particular I found really useful because these are excellent NPCs that you can use in your game. There are also some bits about laws of each group, which is really useful. Very practical stuff at the table because you get also what are the penalties for crime. Or what sorts of things do they consider crime in the first place? So that sort of format continues throughout the rest of this chapter. You get goals, relationships, figures of interest. All right, Chapter 3 begins the Wildemount Gazetteer, and this is the largest chapter of the book. It is about 100 pages, and it just goes region by region, and then takes all the locations within each of those regions, or all the major locations anyway. So the Menagerie Coast is the first one. It's kind of in the southwest of Wildemount. And then you go alphabetical with locations in the Menagerie Coast. Barren Shores, Bisaft Island, Broken Bank, etc., going on alphabetically. So you get some really helpful basic information about each of these locations, which is good. You get stuff for settlements like population, government, defense, commerce, and organizations. Very practical stuff for the Dungeon Master. And when you get to the background section, you can actually roll on a chart to see where your player character is from as well. And I think a Dungeon Master giving the player character the information about the settlement that they're from or the part of the world that they're from is really, really cool and can help you feel like your characters are more a part of this world. The other thing I really like about this chapter is that they include adventure ideas for each area. So here we have Lush Gut Forest, what a name. And then at the end here, we have Lush Gut Adventures. And you can see that this one is described as low level here, and it's just a paragraph, just enough to kind of get your mind going and planning the adventure, the basic story hook for the adventure, but it's enough. Here's another one right here, Blood Diamonds, high level. That one is a very brief description, just kind of the hook, just enough to get you going. So all in all, I mean, if you really counted these up over the 100 pages or so, there's probably over 100 adventure ideas. So that's really, really good. I found this stuff to be really inspiring as a Dungeon Master, even if I don't, and I probably won't, run a campaign in Wildemount. I like having those adventure ideas, and the setting descriptions themselves I think are actually really useful, inspirational, and there are some that I was coming across as very similar to settings in my own world, and kind of taking some inspiration. Oh, I like what they did with this and that. The other thing I'll say is in this 100 pages, I did get a sense of the immense variety that exists here in Wildemount. It is not a setting with a very specific tone. It's a bit of a kitchen sink setting in a lot of ways, which I think those do often make really good D&D settings. You've got all kinds of cultures, climates, you've got very tropical areas, you've got icy areas, different types of terrain, different types of races dominating certain areas, and all that stuff. So a lot of variety evident in the Wildemount Gazetteer. All right, Chapter 4, let's talk about the character options. So as I mentioned with the locations, it's a bit of a kitchen sink setting, so yes, you will see pretty much any race you could possibly want to play here in Wildemount. That is something that, I think critters in general love. They love the variety. They love some of the more kind of fringe races like the Furbolg or the Tieflings or things like that. So you're definitely going to find them here. In Season 2 of Critical Role, there's even a Goblin character. So there's definitely a lot of variety in the races. And the nice thing is if the race is not included in the player's handbook, they did include all the stat information that you're going to need for that race in this book. Even if it was published somewhere else, they're not telling you, go to this other book and go to this other book for this race and things like that. They include it all here, which is great. It's also worth noting that there are a couple new sub-races here. We have for Elf, the Pallid Elf and the Sea Elf. So the Pallid Elf is just very, very pale, and they're newer to the world and wander with childlike curiosity. There's not a whole lot more detail there. The Sea Elves are reclusive and deeply territorial, and it says they have as much in common with merfolk as they do with other elves. So kind of interesting variation there. And then we also have for Halfling, the Lotus Den Halfling, which seems very much like a nature halfling. Certainly would make a good druid. Other than that, you've got information on how a lot of the existing races do fit in this particular setting. For example, for humans, you have how they might look in different parts of Wildemount. And of course, you do get all these kind of more fringe races like the Dragonborn, the Furbolgs, Genasi, and stuff like that. And then you get some fairly monstrous races too, like Goblinkin. You actually get goblins, bugbears, and hobgoblins. You get Goliaths, you get Kenku, you get both half-orcs and full orcs, Tabaxi, tieflings, and yes, even turtles. And then for subclasses, there is a bit of information here on Dunamis and Dunamancy. This is a form of magic, kind of a deeper, more ancient root of magic in a way, that really gets into bending the fabric of reality, especially as it relates to time and space, is kind of my impression of it. So for the fighter, the Echo Knight is very much tied to Dunamancy. The Echo Knight is a fighter who can kind of cast this shadow of themselves, this echo of themselves. You can move it around, you can move to it. It actually can take actions in combat and things like that. So it seems like a really cool idea. I definitely would be interested in trying that out. And then for the wizard, we do have Chronergy magic and Graviturgy magic as two new traditions that are available. They each come with some new magical features that they gain at certain levels. And then of course we also have some new spells. There are 15 new spells. These are obviously going to be available to wizards of these two traditions, but there is a note here about how other player characters, other magic users might be able to get some of these spells. A lot of that would be up to the Dungeon Master. They definitely recommend working on that with your Dungeon Master and working that into the story. And then in Chapter 4, we also get this bit on the Heroic Chronicle, which is a way of developing a more detailed backstory and really tying your character to this world. I love this art, by the way. So cool. So there's quite a bit of detail here, and that could be intimidating for some new players, but I look at this as really good stuff that could be very helpful as a tool for my player characters developing backstories. For prophecies here, it asks characters to write down 3 aspirations or goals you have for your character and which you want to achieve over the course of the campaign. A prophecy goal should have 2 parts. First is the goal that your character wants to attain. Second is a sense of what complication might ensue when the goal is met, for good or ill. So this is really good stuff, but again, I think it might really challenge some players and be difficult for especially newer players. Or players who aren't as into the roleplay and backstory side of things. Still, I think it definitely will help us dungeon masters, because how many times have we asked a player for a background or, tell me more about your family or the town you're from, and just not really gotten much back? Having something like this could really help with that. And then in Chapter 4, we also get some new backgrounds. There are 2 new backgrounds. The first one is the Grinner. And that is, it seems like it would fit very well with a bard, an entertainer, but their goal is actually to spread freedom and inspire hope, or in time revolution, in the hearts of the oppressed. So kind of an interesting one there. Almost reminds me of like a Woody Guthrie or something type of character. And then we get the Volstrucker agent, which is a bit of a like secret agent type character. Who works with the Cerberus Assembly, which I believe is the group that regulates magic in the Dwendalian Empire. So kind of an infiltrator in a shadowy network, it says. So having some new character options is definitely a welcome thing for this book, and I think a lot of players are really going to enjoy those new features. Chapter 5 includes 4 actual adventures in Wildemount. What a great inclusion for a setting book to actually include some adventures. Each of these adventures is about 10, 15, maybe 20 pages. They each take player characters from level 1 to 3, and I would imagine that they would probably take at least 3 sessions, maybe even 4 or 5, depending on how quickly your group moves. We'll read a little bit of info about each here so you can get a feel for them. Tide of Retribution presents a threat to the village of Palmaflora on the beautiful Menagerie Coast. Dangerous Designs is a tale of political intrigue set in the gnomish city of Hupperduk in western Wynandir. I did note that Tide of Retribution is very nautical and has a lot of encounters with the Sahuagin, which I might be saying right. Dangerous Designs, if I'm remembering correctly, had quite a bit with kobolds, and Frozen Sick takes characters on a perilous journey to the far reaches of the biting north and seem to have a lot to do with the undead. Unwelcome Spirits offers a glimpse of the wonders and terrors that dominate eastern Wynandir. So quite a wide variety of monsters and encounters in that one, and there is even a little bit of a kind of a mini hex crawl, which I thought was pretty cool. So to be clear, each of these takes player characters from level 1 to 3. They are not meant to all be played. You would probably play one as a launching point for your campaign, and then at the end they do give ideas for how you might continue and what sorts of questions you might ask players to see where they want to continue. They also do a good job of kind of covering very different regions, different parts of Wildemount. Chapter 6 is all about treasures, so we're mostly talking here about magic items, and there are some really, really cool ones, some ones that I would definitely love to try out in my game. In addition to some, common and very rare magic items, there are these Vestiges of Divergence. These are items that can be very powerful, or they can be kind of mundane. It depends how attuned you are to this item and what sorts of things you are accomplishing. It's kind of like leveling up a magic item. So if you get one of these items, that would be kind of up to you and your DM to try to figure out when you go from dormant to awakened, possibly even to exalted. The last bit of treasure here are the Arms of the Betrayers. These are sentient weapons forged from the souls of fiends by the betrayer gods for their humanoid champions. So yeah, these weapons are like evil. They'll talk to you and things like that and guide you. So some really powerful weapons would be great for your villains, but I could see them also falling into the hands of a player character. Chapter 7, Wildemount Bestiary. There are 23 new monsters. And there's some really cool ones. There's some that are just kind of minor twists on more of the traditional monsters. Others of them are quite different. And I gotta say, I absolutely love the art in this chapter of the book. Probably some of my favorite art here in Chapter 7, the Wildemount Bestiary. So let's just look at some of this. Look at this Gloomstalker, kind of this shadowy wyvern type creature. The Sea Fury art here is terrifying. Love it. And then we end with a glossary, which is a handy thing to have. This right here is where I tore out the map. This time I actually didn't rip it, so hey, that's good. It's tricky. Be careful out there, people. So now that we made it through the book, I want to take a moment and comment on the art in the book. Overall, I was really impressed. There is some recycled art for sure, but there's a lot of original art, and either way, most of the art I really, really liked. I thought it was great. However, there were a few pieces that I came across that I just wasn't very impressed by, and they just didn't seem to fit the style of the book nearly as well. And one example would be here on page 47. Like, this one just looks really cartoony. It's not a bad piece of art by any means. It just looks really cartoony. There's a couple others too. This one right here just doesn't look up to the regular quality level of Wizards of the Coast books. And this one right here, especially when it's opposite this fabulous piece, it just pales in comparison. It doesn't look nearly as good to me. So there's a bit of like mismatched style, but it's also, to me, I just prefer something like this. Now, I did do a little bit of research and found that a lot of the artists they used for this book were actually people who had originally been discovered because they made Critical Role fan art. So I can see this as, okay, we want to make this book not just something we sell to fans of Critical Role, but we want to involve the community. And it's kind of this culmination, this celebration of the Critical Role community when they include that art. And I can see that as cool and worthwhile and valuable, but before I knew that, when I came across pieces of art like this, I just thought, it's just not quite as good. I just don't think it looks great. With the maps, I really, really like most of the maps in the book. I think the world map is excellent. Absolutely love it. Devin Rue did a fabulous job on that. The city maps she did are really great too. I think they're top notch. But as we get into the actual encounter maps, to me, they just aren't nearly as good and aren't up to the regular standards I'm used to in Wizards of the Coast books. The style of these maps just isn't quite doing it for me. So that's my thought on the dungeon maps. But again, the world map is really great. So to wrap things up here, I think this is an excellent product that a lot of people are really going to like, and I think it delivers on a lot of the promise of what we would hope for from a Critical Role D&D collaboration. I could perhaps see some really hardcore critters not being quite satisfied with the level of fan service we get here. I think there definitely could have been more. We could have had the cast, for example, showing up as NPCs, but I think you'll find a lot that you recognize and enjoy as well. I think one of the strengths is that the book really checks a lot of boxes for a lot of different types of people. For the hardcore critter who's just hungry for more information about this world, I think you're going to find that in this book. You don't need to like D&D all that much in order to enjoy this book if you're just looking for something as a companion to the show to really enhance your enjoyment of the show. I think you're going to find it here. For those Critical Role fans who are wanting to run D&D games in this world that they've come to love so much, I think you're going to find what you need here. I think it's going to give you the tools that you need to do that well. Now, for those of you who aren't into Critical Role, maybe you have no desire to watch the show, I actually still think you're going to find a lot to like here. It's just a really solid setting book, whether or not you know anything about Critical Role. I think setting books like Eberron or Ravnica have also been really good, but those settings do take things a little bit further into left field in my opinion. So if you want something really different from the traditional Faerun, Forgotten Realms flavor of fantasy, those books have you covered. But if you're wanting just something that tweaks and twists things a little bit, you want something new, but you don't want something so different from the traditional fantasy in D&D 5th edition, then I think Wildemount has you covered there. Now, if you're a dungeon master who isn't really looking to run games in new settings, but you're just wanting to pick it up for inspiration or for some tools for the table, I think this book could be for you. It's definitely a matter of, is it worth $50 for the amount of tools and inspiration that you get? I can't answer that for you, but hopefully I've given you a good sense from the video of what the book contains so you can answer it for yourself. One of my big takeaways from the Explorer's Guide to Wildemount is how Matt Mercer sets an excellent example, in my opinion, of how a dungeon master can take the core of what a game is. You have your kind of traditional Forgotten Realms flavor of fantasy that D&D 5th edition seems to prefer, and you tweak it and you twist it. Not totally turn it over on its head, but just make enough changes that it feels fresh, it feels new, and ultimately it feels like a place that your players are going to want to spend time, where there's going to be awesome adventures, where great stories can be told. So whether or not you use the world he created, I think the book does provide a good model of how we as dungeon masters can create our own. If you have the book, I would love to hear what you think down in the comments below, and you can feel free to put any questions you have for me down there as well. If you're looking at picking up the book, I do have an Amazon link in the video description, and buying through those links is a great way to support the channel at no extra cost to you. Before we go, I want to give a huge thank you to the WASD20 patrons. These people support the channel on a monthly basis. They're amazing. Thank you so much, patrons. And if you want to join with them in support of my work and also check out some pretty cool rewards that patrons get, head on over to patreon.com/WASD20 and check it out. Thank you all so much for joining me for this one. Take care, everybody, and you'll see me again very soon.